It was 2 in the morning when I caught a woman in leopard print pajamas and a miner's headlamp sneaking around my yard with a can of neon orange spray paint. At first I thought I was dreaming. But no, there she was, our newly crowned HOA president, Karen Wentley, crouching by my fence like some suburban raccoon, muttering something about property lines and taking back what's rightfully communal. The kicker? She sprayed a giant X on one of my cedar fence posts, then pulled out a tape measure and started mumbling HOA bylaw numbers like she was casting a spell. I flipped on the wildlife-triggered floodlights I'd installed after deer kept eating my tomatoes, and Karen froze like she'd been caught robbing Fort Knox. The trail cam got it all, every bug-eyed second of it. That's the moment I realized this wasn't just another passive-aggressive letter stuck to my door. This was war. And if Karen wanted a fight over my fence, I was going to give her one that ended with her losing the road to her own house. 3 days earlier, I was minding my business. Quite literally. I had my laptop on the patio table, my coffee in one hand, and a finalized blueprint for a small greenhouse that I'd just submitted to the county in the other. My wife Samantha was reading a gardening blog out loud, and life felt simple. We'd bought this property 3 years ago because it was just outside the mess of city ordinances but close enough to work remotely and still feel connected. It came with 5 acres, a gentle slope, and a fence that had stood proudly for over a decade. The fence wasn't fancy, it was functional. Pressure-treated cedar, 6 feet tall, lined with some flowering shrubs that Samantha said would someday attract monarchs. Until Karen moved in across the cul-de-sac, nobody ever had an issue with it. I first met Karen when she was yelling at a delivery driver for parking too close to her mailbox. She introduced herself by shoving a clipboard in my face, demanding I sign a petition to ban solar panels that didn't match the community aesthetic. I declined. From that moment, I was labeled one of those individualists on the neighborhood Facebook page. Karen had an opinion on everything. Your porch color, your lawn height, the type of mulch you used. But I never imagined she'd come for my fence. It started with a notice, a bright yellow one, taped to my mailbox with more packing tape than a warehouse package. It stated I was in violation of HOA Rule 4.3b, an item that didn't even exist in the bylaws I'd reviewed when we moved in. The violation? Unapproved fence blocking community access path. The community what? I scanned the area behind my property, which butted up against an empty drainage easement and a line of trees. There was no path. Never had been. The next morning, Karen marched over wearing a wide-brimmed hat like she was inspecting a construction site. She waved a folder in the air and demanded that I begin dismantling the fence within 72 hours to restore historical neighborhood flow. I blinked at her. Then I laughed. She didn't like that. Karen huffed that the fence violated community harmony and had been the subject of multiple complaints. When I asked who had complained, she said that was confidential. She even brought up a fake map showing a walking trail that, according to her, was always meant to connect the neighborhood. I knew she was lying. That trail was on a planning document from a decade ago for a project that never broke ground. The easement was never cleared, never paved, and never legally designated for foot traffic. When I pointed this out, Karen snapped that she had full support of the board, and that my attitude was exactly why the HOA had to get more strict. I asked her what board. There hadn't been a vote since the last president moved to Florida and forgot to cancel his HOA email. She said, "I've assumed interim duties," as if she were a Marvel villain seizing power after a cataclysm. Samantha leaned against the porch railing and asked if Karen even knew what an easement was. Karen said, "I know enough," and stormed off. We didn't hear from her for a day. Then came the flood. Notices, complaints, and even a bogus fine, printed on cheap paper and unsigned. I emailed the county inspector we'd worked with on our greenhouse project, just to be safe. He laughed when I asked if anything had changed regarding the property lines. Everything was solid. Our survey was clear. The fence was on our land, not even brushing against the drainage line. But Karen wasn't done. She wanted that imaginary path opened. And in her mind, that meant tearing down my fence. I decided to play it smart. I started documenting everything. Every visit. Every note. Every weird comment she made during her rant. I backed up trail cam footage, synced it to the cloud, and even installed a small camera by the corner post she seemed most obsessed with. I had a gut feeling that Karen wouldn't stop with passive aggression. She was winding up for something louder. That something came in the middle of the night with a can of paint and a cheap headlamp. After I caught her, she sprinted off like a startled possum. I uploaded the footage and emailed it to the HOA's general address, which I suspected only Karen checked. An hour later, I got a reply. If you share this with the neighborhood, we will consider it a violation of HOA decorum. I replied, try me. The next day, I filed a formal complaint with the county. Samantha submitted a cease and desist letter through her firm, citing property harassment and attempted vandalism. Karen escalated, of course. She went on the HOA Facebook page and claimed I was denying the neighborhood greenway access, and that my illegal fence had cut off a decades-old trail meant for children and the elderly. She included a photo, not of my yard, but of a park 5 miles away. The post got 3 likes and 47 angry laugh react. And then came the real kicker. A contractor showed up at my door with a work order. He said he'd been hired by the HOA to remove my fence that Friday. I asked who signed it. He showed me. Karen Wentley, HOA President Pro Tem. The man looked confused when I started laughing. Sir, you don't want it removed? Oh, buddy, I said. You might want to stand right there while I show you the legal property lines and my restraining order filing. Because if you touch one nail in that fence, your company's gonna be in small claims court for the rest of the year. He left. Karen came by 2 hours later with her hands on her hip. She said I had one last chance to cooperate. I told her to step 1 foot on my lawn and the sheriff would be here in 10 minutes. That's when I noticed it. The printout in her folder. A design blueprint, labeled Garden Walkway Connection Phase 1, that included not just the drainage easement, but a path that ran straight through my vegetable bed. She wasn't just trying to remove my fence. She was trying to build something on my land. That was the moment it hit me. I wasn't just going to stop her. I was going to flip the script so hard that Karen wouldn't even be able to drive to her own house without my permission. Because what she didn't know was that her house, and the entire cul-de-sac, only had one road in. And that road? The strip of land it passed through? It belonged to me. Legally. Fully. Quietly. And she had no idea what was coming next. I didn't sleep much after that night. I kept replaying the footage of Karen creeping through my yard, spray painting my fence like it was some kind of graffiti art installation. Samantha tried to ease my nerves with her usual dry wit, muttering something about HOA standing for harass our acres, but even she was too fired up to laugh much. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office. I'd done my homework before we ever bought this land, but now I wanted every document, plat, easement record, and zoning file that even sniffed near our parcel. I left 2 hours later with a manila folder so thick it looked like it had swallowed a phone book. Back at home, I spread everything across the dining room table like I was plotting a heist. And in a way, I was, only instead of stealing, I was protecting what was mine. That's when I saw it. The narrow strip of land that wrapped around the northern side of our property, just beyond our fence, technically belonged to me. The access road that led into our cul-de-sac cut straight through it. Everyone had always assumed it was public because it was paved decades ago, but legally, it was a private drive built on an easement that expired in 2014 and was never renewed. Which meant Karen had one road to her house. And I owned it. Samantha sat down beside me and stared at the plat map. Then she gave me that grin she usually reserves for courtroom wins. So technically, she said slowly, you could deny access. I nodded. But we're not going to do that yet. First, we're going to find out what else she's trying to pull. Samantha went to work digging. She had access to legal records, permit filings, and municipal court databases. Within an hour, she'd hit gold. Karen had filed a permit request with the HOA using her own signature under the title of acting president, proposing a project labeled Community Wellness Greenway. The blueprint matched the one I'd seen in her folder. What she didn't expect was that the county needed adjacent landowner approval to authorize construction across multiple properties. Karen never submitted my consent. Instead, she fabricated a statement claiming I had verbally approved. She even had some digital signature attached, one that definitely wasn't mine. We printed the entire file and drove to the zoning commission the next day. The clerk reviewed the paperwork, scowled, and flagged it for investigation. "We've had trouble with this HOA before," he said grimly. "You're not the first." That made something click in my brain. Karen wasn't acting rogue. This was her routine. She'd done this before, maybe not to this extreme, but close. I started to wonder how many of her neighbors were quietly suffering because they didn't know how to fight back. Well, I wasn't one of them. Back at home, I drafted a cease and desist notice with Samantha's help, citing the fraudulent signature and unauthorized access attempt. We emailed it directly to the HOA inbox and CC'd the entire board, including the original president who'd stepped down but still monitored the email chain. The silence was loud. Then came a message the next day, not from Karen, but from a board member named Lyle. He apologized profusely and said he was unaware of any vote authorizing the project. That's when I knew Karen was staging phantom votes and hoping no one would call her bluff. Lyle agreed to attend an emergency HOA meeting the following week, open to all residents. Karen tried to delay it, claimed she had a family emergency, but the rest of the board voted her down for once. At the meeting, held in the dusty clubhouse that still smelled like old popcorn and lemon-scented cleaner, the room was packed. Karen showed up 10 minutes late, wearing a blazer like she was walking into a courtroom. I brought a poster board version of the fence spray paint photo and my stack of plat map. Samantha came in with a briefcase like she was going to cross-examine someone. Karen opened with a speech about unity and progress. She spoke in that syrupy sweet tone that only made her sound more condescending. "Our community thrives when we build together," she said. "And greenways increase home values." Then she flipped her own visual, a blown-up map with a trail drawn right through my backyard. That's when I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't insult. I simply stated the facts. I laid out the original land use document. I explained the fake signature. I passed around the video stills of Karen on my property at night, and the forged project proposal. I watched faces in the room twist from curiosity to horror. Someone gasped when I mentioned the illegal easement claim. Lyle asked if she had indeed held a vote without the full board's knowledge. Karen snapped that emergency decisions were part of her role. He asked who declared the emergency. She had no answer. Then I dropped the hammer. I revealed the ownership of the road. The room went silent. Karen blinked like she hadn't heard me right. "The what?" she asked. "The road," I repeated. "The only road to your house. It's on my land. I've got the plat and title records right here. And if I so choose, I can block it off and legally designate it private agricultural access." She turned pale. I could almost see the calculations spinning in her mind, what it would mean to lose direct street access, how much her property would devalue, what she'd have to explain to her husband, who apparently didn't know she'd spent $3,000 of HOA funds on trail planning consultations. I didn't need to finish the threat. The implication was enough. Karen stormed out. The board voted to suspend all Greenway discussions indefinitely. I didn't even smile. It wasn't about winning. It was about stopping someone who thought she could rule by intimidation. That night we thought it was over. But Karen had one more card to play. She returned the next morning, not to our house but to a neighbor's, spewing a story that I was threatening the community and planning to bulldoze the road. That neighbor, a retired mail carrier named Jerry, Called me to ask if I was serious. I explained the truth. Jerry said, "Well, if she starts knocking on my door again, I might install my own fence." I laughed, but I knew the fight wasn't finished. Karen wasn't the kind of person to give up. She was the kind to regroup and go lower. And that's exactly what she did. 2 days later, a crew truck showed up again. This time they didn't come to remove the fence. They were here to survey land for pre-clearing, according to the clipboard the lead contractor held. Samantha intercepted them while I was down at the hardware store. She asked if they had any legal authority to be there. They showed her a form with Karen's signature at the bottom. It said HOA Common Property. The contractor was a kid, probably 20, who looked more confused than defiant. Samantha told them they'd better not move a single rock. She called me, I called the sheriff, and within 20 minutes Deputy Cortez rolled up with his flashing light. Karen showed up 5 minutes later in full meltdown mode. "This is harassment," she screamed at the deputy. "This land is public." Deputy Cortez calmly pointed to the signs I'd posted along the border. Then he pulled out his phone and showed her the deed confirmation I'd emailed the department earlier. Karen tried to argue, but her voice cracked halfway through. Cortez told her any further unauthorized entry would lead to trespassing charges. Karen pointed a shaky finger at Samantha and called her a paralegal witch. I stepped between them and said, "Karen, this ends now. No more lies. No more fake permit. No more surprise crews." She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away. But I knew that walk. That wasn't a retreat. That was someone cooking up something bigger. I watched her stop halfway down the street and glance back at the road she now knew wasn't hers. And in that moment I decided something. I wasn't just going to stop Karen's Greenway dream. I was going to make sure she felt every inch of the boundary she'd tried to cross. She thought she could walk over people. It was time to show her what it felt like to get locked out. Permanently. The day after Deputy Cortez escorted Karen off my property, I walked the perimeter of the land strip where the access road curled around my north boundary. The same strip Karen had crossed a dozen times like it was her God-given sidewalk. It was a narrow passage, maybe 10 feet wide, gravel paved decades ago by the original developer and long assumed by everyone to be public. But it wasn't. According to the updated parcel map and a deed signed and sealed by the county, it was mine. Not a shared easement, not a public way, just a private access path that Karen's property depended on without legal right. The more I stared at that patch of dusty gravel, the more I realized how poetic it would be to turn Karen's entitlement into her own personal inconvenience. She wanted to dictate what happened on my land. Fine. She'd have to ask me for permission every time she left her driveway. I spent the afternoon drafting a construction plan. The idea wasn't to block her immediately. That would turn me into the villain. No, I needed this to be slow, deliberate, and so perfectly legal that not even the most HOA-friendly attorney could poke holes in it. First, I contacted a private contractor I'd used before for utility trenching. I asked him if he'd be willing to regrade and reinforce a portion of the access strip to create a raised, gated utility road. I told him I wanted to use it as part of a future orchard expansion. He laughed and said, "You sure this won't tick off the neighbors?" I replied, "That's the point." I paid in full up front, with permits already in motion from weeks ago tied to my agricultural development plan. Every part of it above board. No sneak attacks. Just progress. And if Karen was in the way of it, well, maybe she should have read the land deeds before playing queen of the cul-de-sac. The work started within days. Karen came flying out of her house the moment the machinery rolled up. She marched up to the lead contractor like she was the mayor and started yelling about how she hadn't been notified. He gestured toward me, and I gave her the warmest neighborly wave I could muster. She stomped across the road but stopped just short of my boundary line. It was like she finally understood that one more misstep would land her in front of a judge. She yelled from the gravel, "You're disrupting street access." I replied calmly, private access. And it's being upgraded. Nothing illegal about that. Her nostrils flared. She screamed, "You're doing this to get back at me." I shrugged. I'm building a road for my farm equipment. If that inconveniences you, maybe next time don't forge easement documents. Karen left without another word, but I could feel the steam rolling off her shoulders like she was a boiling kettle ready to explode. Over the next week, my contractor's crew transformed the gravel path into something Karen couldn't ignore. They raised it, laid a new surface, and installed a series of utility conduit boxes that would eventually serve irrigation lines for the fruit trees I planned to plant. At the entrance, we installed a large metal gate, the kind you see on ranch property, with a keypad access box and a private road sign bolted into a post. It read Carter's Way, Private Agricultural Access Only. Samantha helped me choose the name. She said it was fitting, considering Karen had tried to pave her way through our life. Now it was our turn. The moment the gate went up, Karen's reaction was predictable. She called the sheriff. Again. But this time, it wasn't Deputy Cortez. It was Sheriff Miles himself who showed up, an old friend of mine from high school who knew a thing or two about HOA drama. He pulled me aside, glanced at the permits, the plat maps, and the deed I had laminated in a binder. Then he smiled. "You really dotted every I, huh?" I nodded. "Figured I'd need to." Karen tried to argue, but Miles cut her off. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter, and based on what I'm looking at, Mr. Carter has full authority to do what he's done. If you're unhappy, your best bet is to petition the county for a new public access route." Karen turned redder than a ripe tomato. "That would cost thousands," she shrieked. Miles shrugged. "Then maybe don't build walkways on other people's land next time." Karen sulked back to her driveway. The next morning, her SUV was parked awkwardly near her lawn, wedged at an angle beside a patch of wildflowers she normally wouldn't allow. I watched her fumble with the new route the HOA had to open, an old maintenance trail running through a drainage field at the edge of the community. It was bumpy, poorly graded, and required a 10-minute detour just to reach the mailboxes. Her tires kicked up dust clouds every time she passed by. Samantha and I sat on the porch with coffee, watching in silence like it was our favorite TV drama. Sometimes justice wasn't loud, it was petty, paved, and lined with wild roses. It didn't take long for the rest of the neighborhood to notice the change. Jerry, the retired mailman, walked over with a grin and said, "So, Carter's Way, huh?" I nodded. "Got a nice ring to it." He asked if it was true that Karen couldn't use it anymore. I told him the legal facts, careful not to gloat, though my eyes probably gave it away. Jerry laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his face. "Man, I've been wanting to see her get knocked down a peg for years. You did the whole street a favor." Word spread quickly. Some neighbors even started calling the gravel trail Karen's Loop, referring to the long route she now had to take just to get home. Uke of wicked satisfaction. The cherry on top came in the form of an envelope. A formal letter from Karen, typed and signed, requesting a restoration of shared road privileges in the interest of neighborly peace. She offered to reconsider the community walkway plan and restore mutual respect. Samantha read it twice, chuckled, and slid it across the table to me. "That sound like an apology to you?" she asked. I shook my head. "Sounds like she's begging for access because her shortcut got cut off." I penned a short reply. "No, I mailed it the next day." Karen didn't give up entirely. She started trying to rally support from the HOA board to force a road-sharing agreement. But now that people knew what she'd pulled with the Greenway project and the forged easement claims, her influence was toast. Lyle sent me a private message thanking me for exposing the circus, and said Karen was being reviewed for removal from all board duties. Meanwhile, I kept improving Carter's Way, adding solar lights, planting saplings along the sides, and even installing a small bench at the top of the hill where the road curved. From there, you could see Karen's house tucked awkwardly behind a hedge, her SUV parked beside a new pile of gravel she had delivered, maybe thinking she could build a new route on her own. The final act of poetic irony came when I got a message from a local hiking group. They'd seen the satellite view of Carter's Way and asked if I'd be willing to let them host a weekend nature walk through the orchard path. I agreed on one condition. The trail would stop short of Karen's property line and curve back toward the community gardens. I wanted no confusion. Karen would see the foot traffic, the smiles, the cameras, and know that none of it was for her. Samantha called it the petty parade. I called it karma on gravel. By the end of that month, Carter's Way had become more than just a personal win. It was a symbol. A line in the dirt that proved entitled behavior doesn't win when met with calm strategy, airtight paperwork, and the willingness to stand your ground. Karen still glared from her window every time I drove past the gate, but she never crossed it again. And every time I punched in my access code and watched the gate swing open, I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole mess started: peace. An A2. For a few glorious weeks, peace returned. No strange knocks on the door, no midnight trespassing, no new spray paint incidents or surprise contractors. Karen had gone eerily quiet. Too quiet. I knew her type. Entitled people don't just walk away after a loss. They stew. They plot. They convince themselves that reality can be rewritten if they just shout loud enough or find someone to argue for them. I'd seen her skulking around her mailbox more than usual, phone glued to her ear, her tone low but angry. At first, I figured she was calling every county official in existence trying to reverse what I'd done. But then a new kind of trouble rolled into view, this time in the form of a billboard lawyer with a toothy grin and a slogan that read, "You deserve the win." His name was Brett Harlan. Not to be confused with Judge Harlan, who would come into play later. No, this Brett was the kind of guy who advertised during daytime soap operas and boasted about punishing bullies with flashy courtroom theatrics. Karen must have scraped up whatever money she could, maybe even dipped into HOA funds again, because suddenly I had a thick envelope served to me at my front gate. Inside were legal papers accusing me of willful obstruction of community infrastructure, emotional distress, and targeted harassment. The language was so over the top it read like a soap opera script. According to the suit, my private road closure had caused Karen irreparable harm and turned the neighborhood against her. The best part? They included a doctored photo of my fence, claiming it extended into HOA property, which, of course, it didn't. But I knew what this was. A Hail Mary. A last-ditch legal bluff meant to scare me into backing down. Samantha didn't even blink. She read the complaint with her lawyer hat on, highlighted half a dozen procedural errors, and drafted our official response the same day. We filed a motion to dismiss and countersued for harassment, defamation, and attempted trespass, attaching every shred of documented evidence from the past few months. Trail cam footage, forged easement filings, photos of Karen's spray-painted marks, the illegal contractor work orders. It was all laid out in a neat package that would make any reasonable judge laugh her case out of the room. But we didn't get just any judge. We got the one Karen never expected, Judge Harlan himself. A retired Marine-turned-county judge who ran his courtroom with no tolerance for nonsense or drama. The hearing date arrived 2 weeks later. The courtroom was small, tucked inside the municipal building downtown. Karen showed up in a beige suit with an overly confident swagger, flanked by Brett in a pinstripe ensemble that probably cost more than Karen's last car. Samantha and I sat calmly on our side of the room. I was dressed in a tucked shirt and clean jeans, my unofficial uniform for civil courtroom appearances. Judge Harlan entered without a word and sat behind the bench with an expression that looked carved out of stone. Brett launched into a monologue worthy of a soap opera villain, complete with sweeping hand gestures and emotional buzzwords like community unity and civil cruelty. He painted Karen as a tireless public servant bullied by a selfish landowner. Judge Harlan let him speak for almost 5 minutes before cutting him off. "Counselor," the judge said dryly, Do you have anything based in law, or are we here for amateur theater? The smirk slid off Brett's face like butter off hot toast. Karen fidgeted in her chair. Then it was our turn. Samantha laid out our case with surgical precision. She cited land records, zoning code, the expiration of the access easement, and the legality of the private road development under state guidelines. She didn't even need to raise her voice. It was like watching someone calmly dismantle a sandcastle with a laser. Then she presented our evidence. The video of Karen marking our fence at night, the fake trail maps, the forged HOA approval letters, and the complaint logs from other residents. By the time she finished, you could hear a pin drop. Judge Harlan leaned back and looked over his glasses. "Ms. Wentley," he said, "I'm looking at what appears to be a coordinated campaign of harassment disguised as civic engagement. If even half of this is accurate, you're lucky this is a civil case and not a criminal one." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a goldfish. She stammered that she was trying to improve the neighborhood. The judge cut her off. By forging documents and trespassing on private land? She tried to shift the blame onto the HOA. I was acting in the interest of the board. The judge arched an eyebrow. Then why are 3 of your fellow board members listed in this affidavit denouncing your actions? Karen blinked rapidly. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and she had nothing left to say. The ruling was swift. The court dismissed Karen's case with prejudice, meaning she couldn't file again. He also ordered her to pay our legal fees and issued a formal warning that any further attempt to interfere with our property would result in criminal charges. Brett tried to protest but was shut down with a single word: enough. It was over, at least in the courtroom. But back home, something even more dramatic was unraveling. Word of the trial had spread, and the HOA board was in full meltdown. Lyle, the board member who'd quietly supported us, called and asked if I'd be willing to speak at a special meeting to address some internal issues. I agreed. The next evening, we walked into the clubhouse to find a standing-room-only crowd. Karen wasn't in her usual seat. In fact, she wasn't there at all. Lyle took the mic and read a letter of resignation from Karen, claiming she needed time for personal healing. The crowd clapped. Then Lyle revealed something even juicier. Karen had spent nearly $5,000 in HOA funds without board approval, some of it on her lawyer, some on landscaping plans for a walkway that was never authorized. The board voted to suspend all access to community funds pending a full audit. Residents were livid. A retired teacher stood up and said Karen had fined her for wind chimes. Another man said Karen once claimed his grill was a fire hazard because it clashed with his patio paint. People began connecting the dot. Karen had ruled through fear and intimidation, weaponizing rules that didn't even exist. Now that fear was gone, the mood shifted from anger to celebration. They wanted change. Real change. And they asked if I'd consider joining the board. I politely declined, but Samantha nudged me. "Maybe just as a consultant," she joked. As we walked back home under the stars, everything felt lighter. The burden of months of tension had lifted. No more fake complaints, no more illegal crews, no more threats of forced demolition. My fence stood tall. Carter's Way gleamed in the moonlight, flanked by the baby orchard trees we'd planted. And Karen? Well, she had one gravel detour to her name and a reputation so scorched it could salt the earth behind her. Samantha poured us a glass of wine, and we toasted quietly on the porch. But something told me the story wasn't quite finished. Karen was down, but I doubted she'd disappear quietly. She still lived at the end of the road. She still had access to online forums, legal loopholes, and a bottomless reserve of entitlement. The difference now was that I wasn't waiting for her to make the first move. I had the power now, quite literally, since the entire stretch of Carter's Way was wired with solar cameras and motion alerts. If she so much as stepped foot over the line, I'd know. And deep down I hoped she would. Just once more. Because sometimes, giving someone a taste of their own medicine isn't about revenge. It's about teaching them they're not above consequences. Karen had tried to bulldoze her way through our lives. She didn't know she'd awaken people who were smarter, calmer, and fully armed with the truth. And that truth was now paved, lit, and locked behind a gate with my name on it. It started with the sound of tires crunching gravel just past midnight. I looked up from my book, ears perked, listening for movement. Samantha had already gone to bed, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock. I stood slowly and stepped out onto the porch. There was a low mist settling across Carter's Way, and the moonlight lit up the stretch of road like a silver ribbon winding between the orchard rows. Then I saw her. Karen, dressed in a hoodie pulled tight around her face, creeping along the edge of the road with something bulky under her arm. I didn't move. I just watched. She approached the gate, stopped beside the keypad, and crouched down like she was inspecting it. That's when I realized what she was holding, bolt cutters. She had actually come back to destroy the gate. What she didn't know was that the new keypad was wired to a silent motion alert system, and my phone buzzed the moment she came within 5 feet of it. Before she could even raise the cutters, a floodlight snapped on from the pole just above her. Karen jumped like a startled cat, looking up in horror. Then came the voice from the speaker, Samantha's pre-recorded warning. This property is under surveillance. You are trespassing. Law enforcement has been notified. Karen turned and bolted, cutting across the wildflower patch and disappearing into the trees behind her house. I didn't even bother calling the sheriff. The footage had already been uploaded to the cloud and sent to the HOA board. By morning, everyone would see it. The next day, Samantha made coffee while I reviewed the camera log. There was Karen, caught in full clarity, bolt cutters in hand, inches from vandalizing private property again. Samantha laughed and asked if we should turn the footage into a screensaver. I sent it to Lyle, who called within the hour and said, "We've seen enough. We're calling an emergency HOA vote tonight. This woman's out for good." I didn't even need to attend. The footage spoke for itself. Karen had lost every ounce of credibility she had left. By sundown, the board had officially stripped her of membership, fined her for the attempted property damage, and banned her from holding any HOA position again. That should have been the end of it. But Karen, being Karen, wasn't done embarrassing herself. A week later, a real estate sign went up in her yard. It wasn't one of the common local agents either. It was a flashy luxury firm with a tagline promising executive homes with prime location and access. Samantha and I exchanged a glance. "Access to what?" she said. "Certainly not Carter's Way." I walked over later that evening and took a photo of the listing flyer. Right there in bold lettering, "Easy road access through scenic private drive." My road. A lie. I called the listing agency the next day. I explained that the property did not, in fact, have legal access through Carter's Way, and that the gate was private, locked, and legally restricted. The agent sounded surprised, then annoyed. "She told us that the road was part of the community," he said. "She even said she had a key code." I explained the full history in polite, precise terms. He went silent for a long moment, then muttered something about possible legal exposure, and thanked me for the call. 2 days later, the flyer was pulled and the listing changed. No mention of Carter's Way. No road access. Just a generic cul-de-sac address and a long detour through the gravel service road. It was a quiet win, but a satisfying one. The neighborhood noticed. A few people even stopped by during walks to thank us for what we'd done. One couple brought over cookies, calling us the unofficial sheriffs of the block. Another resident said they were thinking of petitioning to turn Carter's Way into a full greenbelt, with a community garden and benches, all managed independently from the HOA. I liked the sound of that. A place where people could walk, sit, and enjoy the view without fear of being fined for the color of their flower pots. And it wouldn't go through anyone's private yard. Especially not mine. But just when we thought things had finally settled for good, Karen pulled one last stunt. She showed up at the gate, during broad daylight this time, with a small film crew. At first, I thought it was some local documentary or housing promo. But no, she was filming herself, talking into the camera about how she'd been unjustly targeted and driven out by false accusations and power-hungry neighbors. I watched from the porch, completely amused, as she walked up to the locked gate and rattled it for dramatic effect, claiming this was the wall of oppression that ruined her dream for community unity. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so desperate. I didn't say a word. I just pulled out my phone and recorded her recording herself. 10 minutes later, she packed up and left. That night, I uploaded the footage to the same HOA community board she used to flood with complaints. I simply titled it, Karen's Final Audition. It went viral in our small circle. People laughed, joked, and commented things like, "Best episode yet," and "Should we give her an Emmy?" She didn't post again. The silence was golden. A few weeks later, a moving truck pulled up. Karen didn't say goodbye to anyone. No yard sale, no farewell brunch, no friendly waves. She was just gone. Samantha and I stood on the porch as the truck rolled down the bumpy detour and disappeared behind the hedges. And just like that, the shadow that had loomed over our neighborhood finally lifted. Carter's Way became a small landmark. We added solar lanterns along the path, trimmed the orchard rows, and built a wooden bench with a plaque that read, "Peace grows here." Lyle and the board restructured the HOA rules to require full member voting on all projects and spending. They also added a new clause to prevent any single member from assuming power without a democratic vote. It was a small legacy, but an important one. One Saturday morning, we hosted a little picnic along the trail. Neighbors brought food, kids played near the trees, and someone even brought a radio playing classic rock. I stood by the gate for a while, sipping lemonade, and smiled as I watched people relax, laugh, and just enjoy their homes again. No fines, no threats, no entitled rulers. Just a community, finally free from the tyranny of a clipboard and a fake bylaw. As the sun set and the lanterns flickered to life, Samantha slipped her arm around mine and said, "You know, this all started with a fence." I nodded. "And ended with a road." She laughed. "A very poetic one." We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. The quiet spoke for itself. Not just the absence of drama, but the presence of peace. The kind that only comes after you stand up for yourself, dig in your heels, and remind the world that boundaries aren't just lines on a map, they're declarations of dignity. And so Carter's Way remained. Not just as a road, but as a story. A story about how one person tried to control what wasn't hers, and how a community, once afraid to speak up, finally found its voice. And every time I walk that path, past the gate and the trees, I remember that even the pettiest battles can pave the way for the most lasting victories.